The winter came early that year, the kind of early that did. T politely knocked on the door, but kicked it open in the middle of the night. In late October, when most years still carried the soft gold of autumn, the sky turned a flat, metallic gray, and stayed that way. The wind began to move differently, no longer playful or crisp, but sharp, deliberate, and punishing. It swept across the open plains without obstruction, gathering speed as it traveled over frozen soil, and by the time it reached the small rural town, it felt like a blade dragged across exposed skin. By the second week of November, frost no longer appeared only at dawn. It clung stubbornly to fence posts all day. The grass did T-bend, it snapped. The pond behind the Miller property froze so quickly that a thin layer of ice formed overnight, catching a flock of migrating ducks off guard. Thermometers mounted outside kitchen windows began reporting numbers no one liked to see so early in the season. 31 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, lower at night. People prepared the way they always did. The hardware store doubled its firewood orders. Trucks loaded with split oak and maple rattled down gravel roads, leaving thin trails of dust that quickly settled under a hard crust of ice. Neighbors climbed ladders to clean chimneys. Old furnaces groaned awake after months of rest. Plastic sheeting appeared over windows, taped carefully around wooden frames in an attempt to hold warmth inside. Everyone prepared the same way. Everyone except Elias. Elias had lived on the edge of town for nearly 15 years, though town was generous. A cluster of houses stretched along a single main road, with fields unfolding endlessly behind them. His farmhouse stood slightly apart from the others, weathered white paint peeling at the corners, porch boards worn smooth by years of boots. It had been built long before modern insulation standards were ever discussed. The walls were thick but imperfect, and the wind knew exactly where to slip through. On the first morning, the thermometer read 31 degree F before noon. Elias stood on his porch with a mug of coffee cradled in both hands. Steam rose from the cup and disappeared almost instantly into the air. He watched his breath cloud in front of him and drift sideways in the wind. He was surprised by the cold. He was calculating it. Across the road, Mrs. Harper wrestled with a tarp, trying to secure it over a stack of firewood. Her husband shouted instructions from the yard, his voice carried away before it could fully form. Down the lane, a delivery truck dropped off 2 large tanks of heating oil at the Caldwell house. The metal clanged against concrete, echoing sharply in the brittle air. Elias took another slow sip and looked past them all, toward his barn. Inside, 5 cows shifted lazily in their stalls. Their breath rose in thick, steady plumes. Unlike the nervous bustle of humans preparing for winter, the cows seemed unconcerned. They chewed methodically, tails swishing now and then, hooves pressing into straw that still held faint warmth from their bodies. He stepped off the porch and walked across the yard. The ground was already stiff, crunching under his boots. The barn door creaked as he slid it open. A wave of familiar scent met him: hay, earth, animal warmth. It was unpleasant to him. It was grounding. The temperature difference was immediate. Not dramatic, but noticeable. Outside, the air bit at his cheeks. Inside the barn, it merely pressed cool against his skin. He paused just inside the doorway and closed his eyes. There it was. Heat. Not from machinery, not from burning fuel, from life. Each cow generated warmth steadily, quietly, without complaint. Their bodies worked constantly, digesting, breathing, circulating blood. It was invisible energy, but it was there. 5 large animals in an enclosed space created a pocket of survivable air, even when the world outside tried to freeze solid. He walked down the center aisle, resting a hand on the flank of the nearest cow. The hide was thick and warm beneath his palm. The animal shifted slightly, but did move away. "Cold as coming," he murmured, more to himself than to them. That evening, the town gathered at Miller's grocery, as they often did when weather turned threatening. Conversations clustered near the coffee machine. "They are saying it. I'll drop into the 20s overnight," someone said. "Furnace guy is booked solid," another replied. Old Thompson S. unit already gave out. Prices were mentioned in low voices: heating oil, electricity, repairs. Everything had risen. Paychecks had not. Elias stood near the back, listening. He did contribute much to conversations. He rarely did. But he absorbed every word. When he returned home, the house felt hollow and cold. He struck a match and lit the fireplace, watching flames climb hesitantly along thin logs. The chimney drew poorly. It always had. Smoke curled briefly into the room before finding its path upward. He adjusted the flue and waited. The fire helped, but only in the immediate radius. Beyond the living room, the hallway remained chilled. The kitchen floor was icy underfoot. He checked the thermostat mounted near the doorway. 42 degrees. The fire had been burning for nearly an hour. He fed it another log and sat heavily in his chair, staring at the flames. Wood cost money. Oil cost more. Electricity cost most of all. He could ration heat, yes, close off rooms. Layer blankets. Wear coats indoors. But this winter felt different. Longer. He walked to the window and looked out toward the barn. A faint golden glow shone through its small side window. He had left a single bulb on. He imagined the cows standing there, their combined warmth collecting against wooden walls. An idea half-formed for weeks, returned more clearly now. He dismissed it immediately. Too strange, too drastic. He went to bed wearing 2 sweaters and wool socks. The mattress felt cold as stone. He lay awake listening to the wind push against the siding, testing it for weaknesses. By morning, frost traced delicate patterns along the inside edges of his bedroom window. Inside. He rose before dawn and stepped into the hallway. The air felt like a cellar. He turned the faucet in the kitchen slowly, waiting for water to sputter or resist. It flowed. For now, the thermometer read 37° F indoors. Outside, 29° F. He stood there longer than necessary, staring at those numbers. 37 inside with a fire burning through the night. 29 outside. The margin was shrinking. He pulled on his coat and returned to the barn. The cows lifted their heads as he entered. The air inside was noticeably warmer than the yard, though still cool enough to see breath. He closed the barn door behind him and leaned against it, thinking. 5 cows, each producing steady heat. His house had high ceilings, yes, drafty corners, but it was enclosed more tightly than this barn. If warmth could be concentrated and managed, he walked from stall to stall, studying the animals as though seeing them for the first time. They were calm, predictable, resilient. They required feeding and cleaning regardless of weather. He spent hours with them daily already. What if? He shook his head again. The town would never understand. He imagined Mrs. Harper's expression, the laughter at Miller's grocery, the whispers. But he also imagined another week like this, another month. The forecast on the radio crackled that afternoon, a cold front settling in, temperatures holding near freezing for the foreseeable future. Nighttime lows dipping further. He turned off the radio and sat at his kitchen table. The house felt even colder than it had that morning. The fire had gone out. He hadn't bothered relighting it. He pulled a notepad from a drawer and began writing numbers, rough estimates, heat output per animal, square footage of the living room, volume of airspace, heat loss through walls. The math was perfect, but it was absurd. The living room connected to the kitchen and hallway in a semi-open layout. If he blocked off the far bedroom and sealed the hallway with heavy curtains, he could reduce the heated space significantly. He tapped the pencil against the table. It could work. The hesitation wasn't about practicality anymore. It was about perception. The next morning, before most of the town had finished breakfast, Elias opened his front door wide. Cold air rushed in immediately, sweeping across the wooden floor. He crossed the yard and opened the barn. The cows looked at him expectantly. He led the first one out slowly, guiding her with gentle pressure along her side. Her hooves pressed into the frozen ground, leaving deep impressions. Across the road, a curtain twitched. He kept walking. When he reached the porch, he paused briefly, not to reconsider, but to adjust his grip. Then he guided the cow up the wooden steps. The boards creaked but held. The front door stood open, framing the dim interior of his living room. The cow hesitated only a second before stepping inside. Warm breath filled the entryway. Behind him, a car slowed. He did, to look. By the time he led the second cow across the yard, 2 neighbors stood openly watching. One shielded her eyes against the pale winter sun, squinting as if trying to interpret what she was seeing. The third cow followed more stubbornly, hooves clattering on the porch. Someone laughed a short, disbelieving burst that carried clearly in the thin air. Elias remained silent. Inside, he had already prepared the space, rugs rolled up, furniture pushed aside, thick rubber mats laid across the wooden floor. Bales of hay stacked neatly against one wall. Windows cracked slightly at the top for ventilation. He was improvising. He was executing. By the time all 5 cows stood inside his living room, the small farmhouse looked transformed. Large bodies shifted carefully in the space where a sofa once sat. Their breath rose and mingled, forming a visible haze in the cooler air near the ceiling. Outside, 3 more neighbors had gathered. Phones appeared. Someone shook their head dramatically. Elias stepped back onto the porch and closed the front door, firmly behind him. The laughter grew louder then. He heard words like crazy and lost it. He ignored them. Inside the house, the temperature had already shifted slightly, not dramatically, but perceptibly. The cold felt less sharp. He moved calmly among the animals, spreading fresh straw, ensuring spacing, checking airflow. He knew there would be adjustments. He knew it would, to be perfect on the first attempt. But he also knew something the others did. Winter had only begun, and survival rarely asks for permission to look dignified. As evening fell, lights glowed in neighboring houses. Chimneys smoked steadily against the darkening sky. The town settled into its routines, comforted by tradition. In Elias' living room, 5 cows shifted and breathed. The thermometer on his wall slowly crept upward. Outside, the wind continued its relentless sweep across frozen fields, pressing against walls and rattling shutters. Inside, warmth gathered not from flame, not from oil, not from wires hidden behind drywall. From living, breathing bodies. And though the town laughed that night, though whispers traveled faster than the wind, Elias sat quietly at his kitchen table, watching the numbers change. 37, 39, 41. The winter had arrived without mercy, but he had answered it without apology. The truth was something most people in town never paused long enough to consider. They saw the action, the cows stepping through a front door, but not the chain of pressures that led to it. They saw the spectacle. They did see the math. Elias had never been reckless. If anything, he had always been deliberate to a fault. The farmhouse he lived in had belonged to his parents before him, and to his grandfather before that. It had been built in an era when winters were cold, but fuel was cheap, when wood was plentiful, and labor was family. Back then, inefficiency did threaten survival. It simply meant you chopped more logs. But the world had changed quietly over the years. Heating oil prices had crept upward season after season. Electricity rates adjusted with little notices printed in fine text on monthly bills. Repairs that once required a neighbor and a wrench now demanded licensed technicians and invoices. Elias had noticed the climb long before others complained. He kept every bill stacked neatly in a drawer by the kitchen sink. In early autumn, before the first frost, he had laid them all out across the table, 3 winters' worth. He studied the columns of numbers the way a mechanic studies engine noise. Each year had cost more, not dramatically at first, just enough to feel tight, then tighter. By last winter's end, heating alone had consumed a sum that made his chest feel hollow. He had managed it by selling 2 calves earlier than planned and delaying repairs on his truck. It had balanced out, barely. This year would not balance so easily. The farmhouse itself worked against him. It had character, yes. Thick wooden beams, original floorboards, but charm does not stop drafts. The walls were layered with old insulation that had settled unevenly over decades. Cold found the thin spots without effort. The windows, though intact, were single-pane glass set in aging frames. On windy nights, curtains shifted gently inward as if the house were breathing the outside air. He had done what he could. In late October, before the temperature plunged, he spent 2 full days sealing cracks with caulk. He installed weather stripping around doors. He stapled heavy plastic film across the windows and tightened it with a hairdryer, watching it stretch smooth and transparent like a second skin. He laid rolled towels at the base of door frames. It helped, but not enough. When the thermometer outside began hovering at 31 degrees during daylight hours, the inside temperature refused to climb much higher than the low 40s, even with a steady fire. And fires, he knew, were expensive in their own way. Wood had to be purchased now. He no longer had access to free fallen timber the way his grandfather once had. Every log he burned translated into dollars that would not return. He considered alternatives. Electric space heaters were efficient but costly to run continuously. He calculated the wattage, multiplied it by hours, by days, by weeks. The total left him staring at the ceiling. Propane was volatile in price. Delivery fees alone were discouraging. Upgrading the furnace? Impossible. The estimate he received 2 years ago still sat folded in a drawer. The number might as well have been written in another language. He did resent modern life. He simply recognized its arithmetic. Meanwhile, the barn operated under different rules. He stepped inside it one late afternoon, shutting the door against a sharp gust of wind. The difference in air struck him immediately, not warm like a heated home, but stable, less hostile. 5 cows stood in their stalls, chewing slowly. Their bodies were massive engines of biology. Each animal consumed hay and grain, processed it through a complex digestive system, and released energy continuously. Heat radiated from their flanks in a way that required no external fuel. He had always known cows produced warmth. Farmers had relied on that fact for centuries. Old barns were often built attached to houses for that reason. Shared walls transferred residual heat. The concept was not new. It had simply been abandoned in favor of convenience. He walked down the center aisle, boots echoing softly against packed earth. "Each of you," he murmured, resting his palm briefly against a warm hide, "is a heater." He had looked up approximate heat output once, years ago, out of curiosity. The numbers returned to him now. Roughly 1,000 to 1,500 BTUs per hour per cow, depending on size and diet. It was to exact science in his head, but it was enough to estimate. 5 cows could produce between 5,000 and 7,000 BTUs every hour. Sustained. without electric bills, without fuel deliveries, without invoices. He leaned against a wooden post and let the idea unfold fully for the first time. If he could concentrate that heat inside his living space, manage ventilation properly, control moisture, maintain cleanliness, the structure of his house itself would begin to absorb warmth. Wood floors, plaster walls, furniture. Materials hold heat when given time. The problem was whether it was possible. The problem was whether he was willing to endure what people would say. The town valued appearances almost as much as survival. There were unspoken boundaries. Cows belonged in barns. People belonged in houses. Crossing that line blurred more than architecture. It challenged tradition. He imagined the conversations already forming. He lost it. Too proud to admit he can't afford heat. Farm failing. None of it was true in the way they would mean it. He was bankrupt. He was unstable. He was adapting. Still, adaptation often looks like desperation to outsiders. That night, he spread the bills across his kitchen table again. He calculated projected heating costs if temperatures remained near freezing for weeks. He factored in colder nights dipping into the 20s. He added contingency for equipment failure. The total rose steadily, uncomfortably. Then he calculated the alternative. Additional hay consumption if cows spent nights indoors. Minor adjustments to airflow. Extra labor for cleaning. The difference between the two columns of numbers was stark. One column meant depletion, the other meant sustainability. He tapped the pencil against the table and stared at the wall clock ticking steadily above the doorway. Pride did not pay bills. Pride did not thaw frozen pipes. Pride did not keep floors from splitting in extreme cold. He stood and walked into the hallway. The air felt sharp in his lungs. He placed his hand against the interior wall facing the outside. Cold. He imagined 5 steady sources of heat radiating in the adjacent room. He imagined nights where the temperature inside did not fall below 45 or 50. Not comfortable by suburban standards, perhaps, but safe. He had read once about European farmhouses centuries ago where livestock and humans shared structures during winter. Body heat combined with small hearth fires created survivable environments long before central heating existed. Had they been foolish or practical? He moved back into the living room and studied its layout. The sofa could be shifted against the far wall, the coffee table removed entirely, the large woven rug rolled up to protect it. He could lay down rubber mats from the barn to protect the floorboards. Straw bedding would absorb moisture and provide traction. Ventilation was critical. Without airflow, condensation would build, leading to dampness and odor. He would need to crack upper windows slightly, allowing humid air to escape while retaining the majority of warmth. Cross-ventilation, controlled and minimal. He measured the room roughly in his head. Square footage multiplied by ceiling height gave him volume. He was seeking perfection, only improvement over the current 40-degree stagnation. Outside, the wind intensified as evening approached. It rattled the loose shutter near the back bedroom. He walked into that bedroom and closed the door firmly. He would not heat the entire house. That much was clear. He would concentrate warmth in the living room and kitchen area. The rest could remain cold, sealed off with heavy blankets hung as barriers. He began visualizing daily routines under the new arrangement. Morning feeding could occur indoors. Water buckets would need careful placement to prevent spills. Cleaning would be non-negotiable, twice daily, thorough and disciplined. He had always kept a clean barn. He would maintain the same standard inside. The more he examined the logistics, the less absurd it seemed. What remained was the social consequence. He sat back down and looked at his phone. A message from a neighbor earlier that day mentioned stocking up on extra propane before prices climbed again. He imagined replying, "I need it." He almost smiled. The next morning he visited Miller's grocery for feed supplies. The air inside the store was warm from a humming heater near the entrance. Conversation swirled around him. They were predicting a long freeze. Someone said near the coffee machine. "Oil delivery is already delayed," another replied. "Everyone's ordering at once." He stood quietly, absorbing the tone beneath the words. Anxiety, financial strain. No one admitted it directly, but it was there. He paid for his supplies and stepped back into the cold sunlight. His breath formed clouds instantly. On the drive home, he made his decision fully. He would move the cows inside, not permanently, not recklessly, but strategically. That afternoon, he began preparing without announcing anything. He cleared furniture from the living room methodically. Each movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. He rolled the rug tightly and carried it into the closed-off bedroom. He lifted framed photographs from low shelves and relocated them higher on walls. He secured electrical cords safely out of reach. Then he walked to the barn and measured the rubber mats beneath 2 stalls. He calculated how many he would need to protect the most trafficked areas of the floor. He loaded them onto a small cart and wheeled them across the yard. the edges scraping faint lines into frozen soil. A passing truck slowed. He did not look up. Inside the house, he laid the mats carefully, edge to edge, covering the center of the living room. He tested their grip against the wooden boards. Stable. He stacked hay bales along the far wall, creating a boundary that would help guide the cows. Positioning. He opened the upper sash of 2 windows by less than an inch, testing airflow with his hand. A subtle draft, but manageable. He stepped back and surveyed the room. It no longer resembled a traditional living space. It resembled a plan. As dusk approached, the temperature outside dropped again. 31 degrees by late afternoon. Forecast promised colder overnight. He stood between house and barn, the space silent except for wind brushing dry grass. The decision hovered in the air like visible breath. He was not acting out of impulse. He was acting out of arithmetic. He opened the barn door. The cows lifted their heads in unison. He rested his hand against the first animal, his flank, and exhaled slowly. "This is going to look strange," he murmured. But strange had never frightened him as much as helplessness. He led the first cow out into the yard. Frost cracked under hooves. The farmhouse door stood open ahead, a rectangle of dim interior space waiting. Across the road, curtains shifted. He continued walking. He felt the weight of observation even before voices began. He heard a car engine slow. He sensed disbelief before laughter formed. Yet beneath all of it was something steady and unshakable. He had done the calculations. He had measured the costs. He had compared pride against survival and found pride too expensive. By the time the first cow stepped across the threshold into his living room, the truth was no longer theoretical. It was embodied. Warmth followed. The first evening the cows slept inside. The entire street buzzed with a kind of energy usually reserved for emergencies or celebrations. But this was neither. It was spectacle. Word had traveled faster than the wind that day. By the time Elias finished guiding the last cow into the living room and secured the front door, at least 6 neighbors had seen enough to form opinions. Some stood openly at the edge of their driveways. Others watched discreetly from behind curtains, pretending to adjust blinds while their eyes stayed fixed on his porch. "Did you see that?" Mrs. Harper whispered to her husband, though there was no one else within earshot. "He's brought them inside," he replied, shaking his head slowly, as if saying the words out loud might make them more reasonable. Across the lane, a teenager filmed from a bedroom window, zooming in on the farmhouse. Within an hour, a short clip had circulated through group chats and social media pages connected to the town. The caption read, "When winter hits different." Laughing emojis followed. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the one forming outside. The cows stood cautiously at first, adjusting to the new environment. Their hooves pressed into the rubber mats, testing unfamiliar footing. The room, though rearranged, still carried faint traces of human life wood polish, old fabric, cooled fireplace ash. The cows. Breath rose in visible streams, mingling near the ceiling before thinning toward the cracked windows. Elias moved calmly among them. He guided one toward the hay bales he had positioned along the far wall. Another shifted closer to the center of the room. He spoke softly, not in full sentences but in low tones of reassurance. He had worked with these animals long enough to know their temperaments. They responded more to steadiness than to commands. Outside, the sky dimmed into a cold, bruised purple. Porch lights flickered on up and down the street. The air temperature dropped another few degrees. Inside, something subtle began to change. It once to immediate warmth. Not like standing near a fire. It was more gradual, a softening of the air. The sharp edge of the cold began to dull. The living room no longer felt like a hollow shell exposed to the outdoors. It felt occupied, alive. Elias walked to the kitchen doorway and checked the thermometer mounted beside it. 40 degrees. It had been 37 less than an hour earlier. He did smile. He simply noted it. The first knock came just after 7 in the evening. He expected it. When he opened the door, 2 neighbors stood on the porch, bundled to heavy coats, expressions balanced between concern and barely concealed amusement. "We just wanted to make sure you were all right," one of them began carefully. Behind them, down the road, a small cluster of figures lingered under a streetlight, pretending not to watch. "I am fine," Elias replied evenly. There was a pause. "Are those your cows?" the second neighbor asked, as though clarification might reveal a different explanation. "Yes." "You know inside?" "Yes." Silence stretched between them. From within the house, a low, steady exhale from one of the cows drifted outward. The first neighbor cleared his throat. "It is just people are talking." Elias nodded. "They usually do." The wind gusted suddenly, cutting across the porch and forcing both visitors to pull their collars tighter around their necks. "It is going to be a cold night," Elias added quietly. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, clearly uncertain how to proceed. Well, one finally said, "If you need anything." "I don tea," Elias replied, not unkindly. He closed the door gently. Inside, the air felt noticeably different now. Not warm, but stable. Less punishing. The cows had settled, chewing methodically, bodies radiating constant heat into the confined space. He checked the thermometer again. 43 degrees. Outside, it had dropped to 29. The margin was widening. He moved into the kitchen and boiled water on the stove, partly for tea, partly to introduce a bit of additional warmth into the air. Steam rose and drifted toward the ceiling, blending with the faint haze created by 5 steady breaths. He sat at the table and listened. No furnace kicking on. No crackling logs demanding replacement. Just the slow rhythm of animals and the occasional shuffle of hooves against rubber. Across the street, laughter erupted briefly, then faded. A car door slammed. Another vehicle idled longer than necessary, headlights lingering on his house before moving on. He imagined the commentary spreading. He has finally lost it, living with livestock now. Next thing you know, he'll move into the barn. The words did sting as much as they might have years ago. Age had a way of thinning sensitivity to ridicule. Survival, too, had a way of narrowing focus. Later that night, he dimmed the lights and prepared for sleep. He had rearranged his routine slightly. Instead of retreating fully to the bedroom, he spread blankets on a small cot in the kitchen area near the living room. It was strategic. He wanted to monitor conditions overnight. He lay down fully clothed, listening to the wind test the outer walls. Normally, on nights like this, he could hear subtle creaks as wood contracted in the cold. Tonight, those sounds felt muted. The cows shifted occasionally, a hoof adjusting, a low murmur of breath. Their presence filled the house in a way furniture never had. He closed his eyes. Sometime past midnight, he woke briefly and reached toward the thermometer mounted in the kitchen. He squinted in the dim light. 48 degrees. He lay back slowly. Outside, temperatures had fallen further 26, according to the late-night forecast he had heard earlier. Inside, he was nearly 20 degrees warmer without burning a single log. Morning arrived pale and brittle. Sunlight filtered through the slightly cracked windows, catching suspended particles of straw and dust in thin golden beams. The cows were calm. The air felt heavy but not unpleasant. Cool still but survivable without layered coats. He stood and stretched, noticing something immediately. The floor no longer felt icy through his boots. It held a faint residual warmth from the night. Accumulation. He checked the thermometer. 49 degrees. Outside, frost covered everything in a silver sheen. He stepped onto the porch briefly. The cold hit him instantly, a sharp contrast to the interior air. Mrs. Harper stood across the road, pretending to scrape ice from her windshield while clearly watching him. "Morning," she called out. "Morning," he replied. She hesitated before asking, "How did it go?" "Fine." She studied his expression, searching for embarrassment or regret. She found neither. Throughout the day, more cars slowed as they passed. Some drivers stared openly. Others shook their heads. By afternoon, the small grocery store conversation had shifted tone. The initial laughter softened into curiosity. "Did it actually warm his house?" someone asked. "I heard it. It's warmer than mine," another admitted reluctantly. Still, a third insisted it's not normal. Normal. The word hung in the air like a standard no one had formally defined. That evening, the temperature outside again hovered near 21 degrees, dipping lower as darkness settled. Elias maintained his routine with precision. He fed the cows indoors, cleaned thoroughly, replaced straw, monitored airflow. A faint smell lingered in the house, now earthy, organic, not overwhelming, but present. It was the price of proximity. He accepted it. The thermometer climbed again after sunset. 50 degrees. The house began absorbing the heat more effectively now. Walls that had been chilled for weeks slowly released stored cold while simultaneously taking in warmth from the steady animal output. By the third night, something shifted in the town's reaction. Instead of laughter, there were questions. A neighbor stopped by again, less amused this time. "How warm is it really?" he asked, peering over Elias' shoulder into the living room. 52, Elias answered, pointing toward the thermometer. The neighbor blinked. "My furnace ran nonstop last night," he muttered. "Still did. Hit 50. They stood in silence for a moment, watching one of the cows chew methodically. "It does tea bother you?" the neighbor asked, "having them in here?" Elias considered the question carefully. "What bothers me," he replied finally, "is frozen pipes." The neighbor nodded slowly. Across town, 2 households dealt with burst plumbing that week. Emergency repairs cost more than many could comfortably afford. The cold was proving relentless. Inside the farmhouse, warmth accumulated not in bursts but in persistence. By the end of the first week, the ridicule had nearly evaporated. In its place lingered a quieter emotion, reconsideration. Children who had giggled earlier now walked past more thoughtfully. Adults who had shaken their heads now calculated privately. On the coldest night so far, when the temperature dropped to 24 degrees, Elias' living room held steady at 53. He sat at his kitchen table again, this time not surrounded by unpaid heating bills, but by a stable quiet. The cows breathed steadily behind him. The house no longer felt hollow or vulnerable. Outside, the wind continued its relentless sweep. Inside, warmth endured. The town had laughed on the first evening, certain that absurdity could not possibly hold up against winter. But winter did not care about appearances. It cared about physics, and physics, quietly and without concern for gossip, was on Elias' side. By the fourth day, the novelty had worn off for everyone except the wind. The wind still came hard across the fields, flattening brittle grass and pressing against siding as if testing it for weakness. But inside Elias' farmhouse, something steady had taken root. The warmth was no longer accidental. It was maintained. He had begun refining the system. The first adjustment came after noticing condensation forming lightly along the lower edges of two windows. 5 large animals exhaling into a confined space produced humidity more than he had calculated initially. Moisture could become an enemy if left unmanaged. Damp air made cold feel sharper, not softer. It could warp wood, invite mildew, and compromise the very structure he was trying to protect. So he adapted. He shifted 2 hay bales away from the wall to allow better air circulation. He opened one upper window a fraction wider, no more than half an inch, and installed a small vent panel he built from scrap wood and mesh to direct airflow upward rather than across the room. He monitored the draft with a strip of cloth taped near the opening, watching how it moved. The goal was balance. Warmth without stagnation. Heat without dampness. He woke earlier than usual that morning, before sunrise, to check readings. Outside 27 degree F. Inside 50 degree F. He knelt near the floor and placed his palm flat against the boards between the rubber mats. The wood felt cool but no longer biting. He moved his hand to the plaster wall that faced the yard. It, too, held a trace of retained warmth. The house was beginning to behave differently. Buildings remember. Cold seeps in slowly, and warmth takes time to replace it. But once materials absorb heat, they do not surrender it easily. His grandfather used to say that a house must be convinced to stay warm. It cannot be commanded. Now the house was being convinced. Across the road, Mrs. Harper. Chimney smoked heavily from early morning until late night. The Harpers had doubled their firewood consumption this week. Their son mentioned in passing at the grocery store that they might need another delivery before January. At Miller's grocery, conversations had shifted in tone. His Pipes Haven tea frozen, someone observed. Mine almost did, another admitted quietly. He hasn't turned on his furnace once. That detail spread more quickly than the original laughter. By midweek, 2 more neighbors had stopped by not to mock, but to ask questions with cautious seriousness. How are you handling the smell? How often do you clean? What about the floors? Elias answered plainly. Twice daily cleaning, straw replaced regularly. Rubber mats protect the boards, ventilation controlled at the top, not ground level. He did tea oversell it. He did tea evangelize. He simply explained what he had done. The questions continued. Is it really 50 degrees in there? 52 this morning. They would glance past him into the living room, eyes widening slightly at the sight of 5 cows standing calmly where a couch once sat. It looked wrong, but it worked. On the 6th night, a stronger cold front moved in. The forecast warned of sustained freezing temperatures and high winds. The town braced. Hardware shelves emptied of pipe insulation and portable heaters. A rumor spread that heating oil deliveries were delayed again due to demand in neighboring counties. That evening, Elias performed his routine with heightened focus. He increased straw bedding slightly to absorb additional moisture. He ensured water buckets were positioned where accidental tipping would. Tea spread across the floor. He checked each vent opening twice. The cows were accustomed now. They entered and settled with little resistance. Their large forms filled the room with steady presence. He placed a small secondary thermometer near the hallway curtain barrier to monitor heat transfer beyond the main living area. 47 degrees at that point, cooler than the living room, but significantly warmer than it would have been otherwise. The wind began howling shortly after dark. It struck the farmhouse hard, rattling shutters and pressing against the front door. In previous winters, such winds would have forced him to feed the fire constantly. Tonight there was no fire, only breath. Only Bioje. He sat at the kitchen table and listened carefully. He could hear the wind, yes, but it felt distant. The interior air did not drop sharply with each gust, the way it once had. The accumulated warmth acted as a buffer. By midnight, the outdoor temperature had fallen to 20 degrees F. Inside, 52 degrees F. He stood in the doorway and let that fact settle. 30 degrees difference. Without fuel, without machinery, across town, lights flickered briefly in several houses as electrical demand strained local lines. One household lost power entirely for 2 hours. Portable heaters went dark. Panic rose quickly in cold darkness. Elias remained steady. The next morning revealed the consequences of the storm. Mrs. Harper's youngest son discovered a frozen pipe in their basement. The Caldwell family reported that their furnace had failed overnight. They were waiting for a technician who could not arrive until afternoon. 2 homes experienced minor water leaks due to frozen fittings. At Miller S. Grocery, the atmosphere felt subdued. No one expected it to drop that low. Someone muttered. It is not even January yet. Elias entered quietly, purchased feed, and listened. Finally, someone addressed him directly. So, your place held up? It did. A pause. How warm. 53. The number landed heavily in the room. No laughter followed. That afternoon, a neighbor named Daniel walked over carrying a notebook. Would you mind walking me through it? He asked. Elias hesitated only briefly before nodding. Inside the farmhouse, Daniel stood carefully near the doorway, boots planted on the edge of rubber matting. His eyes moved across the room studying positioning, spacing, airflow. You were basically using them as living heaters, Daniel said slowly. They are living heaters, Elias replied. Daniel scribbled notes. You're not worried about air quality. I monitor it. Ventilation stays at ceiling level. Moisture escapes upward. No ammonia buildup if cleaned properly. Daniel looked impressed, despite himself. I spent $600 on extra oil this month, he admitted quietly. Still barely hit 45 inside. Elias did. T responded with superiority. He simply handed Daniel a scrap of paper with rough heat output calculations. 5 cows, Daniel murmured. 7,000 BTUs, give or take. Steady output, Elias said, not bursts. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. By evening, 2 other neighbors had stopped by, less formally, but with similar intent. The laughter from earlier in the week had fully dissolved. In its place grew something less comfortable for the town, recognition. Recognition that innovation does not always look polished, recognition that tradition sometimes abandons useful knowledge. Recognition that pride can be expensive. Inside the farmhouse, the walls had begun to radiate retained warmth, even in early mornings before sunrise. Floors no longer shocked through boots. The air felt consistently stable between 50 and 54 degrees, depending on wind intensity. Elias noticed something else as well. His stress had diminished. Before moving the cows inside, each cold forecast triggered anxiety. He calculated costs obsessively. He worried about frozen plumbing. He rationed firewood carefully, measuring each log against the days remaining in winter. Now, he focused on maintenance rather than survival. He cleaned thoroughly each morning and evening. He adjusted straw levels. He monitored humidity with a simple gauge mounted near the window. It was effortless, but it was controlled. One evening, as he replaced bedding, Mrs. Harper appeared at his door again, this time alone. I need to ask you something, she said plainly. He stepped aside to let her in. She looked uncomfortable at first, eyes darting to the cows. Is it really that much cheaper? She asked quietly. Yes. She hesitated before continuing. We were burning through wood faster than we can afford. Harold won, he admitted, but she trailed off. Elias waited. Would it help, she finally asked, if we moved the barn closer to the house? Or opened the wall between? He nodded slowly. Shared wall transfers heat, he explained. Even partial enclosure helps. She exhaled, absorbing the idea. We laughed, she admitted softly. I know. You don't seem bothered. I'd rather be warm. She smiled faintly at that. By the second week, subtle changes appeared around town. One farmer sealed off a breezeway between his barn and kitchen to allow limited heat transfer. Another installed temporary ducting between structures to circulate air. No one publicly credited Elias, but they had watched. They had calculated. The cold persisted. The house remained steady. On the coldest recorded night so far, 27 degrees F, with wind chill over the living room thermometer read 54 degrees F. Elias sat quietly, hands wrapped around a mug, listening to the slow breathing behind him. He thought about the phrase people had used at the beginning. It is not normal. He considered that carefully. Normal had cost money he did to have. Normal had nearly frozen pipes. Normal required constant consumption. What he had built instead was not spectacle. It was adaptation rooted in physics and observation. The cows shifted gently in the dim light. The wind pressed again against the siding, relentless as ever. But inside, warmth held firm, not dramatic, not luxurious, but sufficient. Science had not announced itself with fanfare. It had simply worked. And slowly, without speeches or declarations, the town began to understand that sometimes the line between ridiculous and revolutionary is measured in degrees Fahrenheit. The turning point did not arrive with applause or public apology. It arrived with a weather alert. 3 weeks into the experiment, just as the town had settled into an uneasy acceptance of Elias as unconventional arrangement, the forecast shifted sharply. A mass of Arctic air was descending faster than expected, dragging temperatures down with it. Meteorologists on the radio used phrases like historic low and prolonged freeze. Wind speeds would increase. Nighttime temperatures would plunge well below what the town had experienced so far. By late afternoon, thermometer already hovered near 28 QEF and falling. At Miller S. Grocery, the atmosphere felt heavier than it had all winter. People were not laughing now. They were calculating. They were saying it could hit the teens. Someone said quietly, "That is pipe-bursting weather." Oil truck S delayed again. The store owner had run out of portable electric heaters. Space heaters were gone. Even insulation foam was nearly sold out. Elias stood near the counter, purchasing extra straw and feed. He listened without inserting himself into the conversation. He need to. Everyone in the room had already done the math privately. If it was hard at 31 degree F, what would it be at 18 degree F? He returned home before sunset and began preparing with deliberate care. Inside the living room, the cows shifted calmly, accustomed now to their indoor routine. The air temperature was holding steady at 52 degree F. Outside, the wind was beginning to gather strength. He reinforced the ventilation system slightly, narrowing one window opening to retain more heat while keeping airflow sufficient. He added an extra layer of heavy curtain at the hallway barrier to prevent heat drift toward unused rooms. He checked water buckets twice. He spread fresh straw more generously than usual, building insulation beneath hooves. He was not panicking, he was preparing. As darkness settled, the wind rose sharply. It howled around corners and slammed loose shutters. The sound was different from previous nights, more aggressive, more persistent. By 9 p.m., the outside temperature had dropped to 22 degrees F. Inside, 53 degrees F. He sat at the kitchen table, listening to the radio updates. The announcer's voice carried tension now. Residents are advised to take precautions. Keep faucets dripping to prevent freezing. Limit outdoor exposure. Check heating systems. Elias glanced toward the living room. 5 cows stood quietly, chewing. No furnace roared to life. No fuel gauge ticked downward. Just steady biological output. By midnight, the cold intensified further. 18 degrees F. Wind gusts above 30 miles per hour. Inside, 52 degrees F. He rose from his cot and walked slowly across the living room, placing his hand against the wall facing the wind. The surface felt cool but not frigid. The house, now thoroughly warmed over weeks, was resisting the assault more effectively than ever before. He felt a strange calm. Around 1:30 a.m., headlights flashed briefly across his window. A vehicle passed slowly, then another. Somewhere down the road, a generator sputtered to life. By morning, the temperature outside had fallen to 15 degrees F. 15. The number felt unreal for this town. Elias stepped briefly onto the porch and inhaled sharply. The air stabbed his lungs. Frost coated every surface in a thick, crystalline layer. Even the mailbox hinge had frozen stiff. He re-entered quickly. Inside, 51 degrees F. 36 degrees warmer than outside. Without fuel. Without electricity beyond basic lighting. He poured coffee and stood quietly near the thermometer, letting the reality settle in. A knock came shortly after sunrise. It was not tentative this time. He opened the door to find Daniel standing there, cheeks flushed from the cold. "My furnace quit," Daniel said bluntly. "Saw time around 3 in the morning." Elias stepped aside without hesitation. Daniel entered slowly, eyes widening as the warmer air enveloped him. "Yes, comfortable," he said, almost in disbelief. 51. Elias replied. Daniel removed his gloves and flexed his fingers, letting sensation return. "We barely hit 40 before it died," he admitted. "Then it just shut off." "Technician coming?" "Earliest is tomorrow afternoon." Silence lingered between them. Daniel glanced toward the cows. "I never thought I'd say this," he muttered, "but you were right." "Elias did," T responded with triumph. He simply nodded. Daniel stayed for nearly an hour, warming up, asking technical questions. He took notes again, more carefully this time. Across town, similar problems unfolded. The Caldwell family's furnace struggled to maintain heat under the strain and shut down twice overnight. The Harpers reported another frozen pipe in their basement despite running faucets continuously. A transformer down the road failed temporarily due to high electrical demand, leaving 3 homes without power for several hours. The cold had stripped away pride. By afternoon, the outside temperature had only climbed to 19 degrees. Wind remained relentless, Elias, as living room held at 52 degrees. The house felt steady, almost defiant. Midday brought another knock. This time it was Mrs. Harper. She looked exhausted. "We're staying with my sister tonight," she said quietly. "Harold is trying to fix the pipe, but the basement is too cold." She glanced past Elias into the living room again, no trace of ridicule in her eyes, now only recognition. "It is really that warm in here?" she asked. "Yeah." She stepped 1 foot inside, testing the air. "I can believe we laughed," she said softly. "You weren't the only ones." She nodded. "People are asking about it now." "I know." The turning point was not a single moment of public acknowledgement. It was a shift in tone and posture in the way neighbors approached his door. That evening, as the temperature dipped again towards 16 degrees, 2 more residents stopped by not to observe but to consult. One asked about moisture control. Another asked about ventilation specifics. Someone else wanted to know whether fewer cows would still make a difference. Elias explained patiently. "Even 2 or 3 generate meaningful heat in a confined space. You have to clean regularly. Vent high, not low. It is about accumulation over time." No one recorded videos now. No one laughed. Instead, they listened. That night was the coldest yet. 14 degrees just before dawn. The kind of cold that makes wood crack audibly. The kind of cold that tests insulation to its limit. Inside, the thermometer read 52 degrees at 5 a.m. Elias stood alone in the dim light, staring at it. He thought back to the first evening, the whispers, the laughter, the camera phones. He thought about the calculations spread across his kitchen table. He thought about the simple equation that had guided him: available heat versus required heat. Physics had not betrayed him. Outside, frost crept higher along neighboring windows. Inside, warmth remained steady. Later that morning, the town gathered again at Miller's grocery. The mood was different now, quieter, humbler. Daniel S. furnace is out. Harper S. basement flooded. Power flickered all night. Then someone said it plainly. Elias S. house stayed above 50. No sarcasm, no disbelief, just fact. The words hung in the air. For the first time, the room did not respond with laughter. It responded with thought. By the 3rd consecutive day of extreme cold, small adjustments began appearing across town. A breezeway sealed here. A barn door reinforced there. One farmer moved 2 calves into an attached storage room to share warmth with a kitchen wall. No announcements were made, but change was happening. That afternoon, Daniel returned with a small gift of thermos of hot stew. "For the advice," he said. Elias accepted it with a nod. "You saved us a lot more than heating oil," Daniel added quietly. Elias looked toward the cows. They did. The wind finally began to weaken on the 4th day. Temperatures climbed slowly back toward the mid-20s. Still cold, but less punishing. The crisis had passed. Damage across town was being assessed: burst pipes repaired, heating systems serviced, fuel tanks refilled at considerable expense. Inside the farmhouse, the living room remained steady at 51 degrees. When the cows shifted gently in the afternoon light, their breath visible but calm, Elias felt something settle deeply within him. Not vindication. Not pride. Validation. The turning point had not required speeches. It had required numbers. 14 degrees outside. 52 inside. No furnace. No oil. No electricity beyond necessity. Just 5 animals and a willingness to endure temporary ridicule in exchange for long-term stability. As evening approached and the sky cleared for the first time in days, a soft golden light spread across the frozen fields. Neighbors walked more slowly now, nodding in his direction when their eyes met his. Respect had replaced amusement. And though no one formally apologized, their questions, their visits, their quiet adaptations spoke louder than laughter ever had. Winter had tested the town. It had exposed weaknesses in systems people assumed were reliable. And in the middle of it, a living room filled with cows had held steady proof that survival often favors those willing to look foolish before they look wise. Spring did not arrive suddenly. It crept in, cautious and uneven, loosening winter. Grip 1 degree at a time. The wind softened first. Then the morning stopped biting quite so sharply. Patches of snow along fence lines began shrinking into damp shadows. The earth, once iron-hard, started to yield under boots. Inside Elias' farmhouse, the change felt gradual but noticeable. For weeks, the living room had held steady in the low 50s, sometimes mid-50s on milder days. The cows' warmth had been constant, unwavering through the harshest stretch of winter. But now, as outdoor temperatures began climbing into the mid-30s and occasionally the 40s, the interior readings rose more easily. 55, 58. On one unexpectedly bright afternoon, the thermometer briefly touched 60. Elias stood beneath it, studying the number quietly. The room no longer felt like a shelter from danger. It felt almost comfortable. The cows shifted lazily in the softened air. Their thick winter coats, once essential, now seemed excessive. They breathed less visibly. The urgency that had once defined each evening checking vents, layering straw, sealing curtains eased into routine maintenance rather than survival strategy. The town, too, had shifted. Where there had once been whispers and sideways glances, there were now nods. Conversations at Miller's grocery carried a different tone when Elias entered. People did not stare anymore, they asked. Planning to move them back soon? Think you will do it again next winter? How much do you think you saved? The last question came up often. Elias had done the math again, once temperatures stabilized. Compared to previous winters, his heating costs had been nearly non-existent. A small amount of electricity for lighting. Minimal wood burned on a handful of especially damp days. The bulk of what would have gone to fuel had remained untouched. But when people asked how much he saved, he did not answer with a number. Enough, he would say simply, because it was the only money. It was stress avoided. It was pipes that never froze. It was nights spent sleeping instead of calculating. One evening in early March, Daniel stopped by again, this time without urgency in his posture. He leaned against the porch railing and looked across the thawing yard. You know, Daniel began. I sealed off my breezeway after that cold snap. Kept the barn wall exposed to the kitchen side. Did to bring them inside, like you did, but the heat transfer made a difference. Elias nodded. Cut my oil use by nearly 30%, Daniel added. Never would have tried it otherwise. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the low sun stretch shadows across melting frost. You changed more than you think, Daniel said finally. Elias did not respond immediately. Change had not been his goal. Stability had. Inside, one of the cows shifted her weight, hooves pressing softly against the matting. The time had come. The ground outside was no longer frozen solid. The barn, though cold in winter, now felt suitable again. Spring would bring its own rhythm, grazing, fresh air, open doors. The living room had served its purpose. It would return to being a living room. The transition began gradually. Elias opened windows wider during the day, letting fresh air sweep through fully for the first time in months. He reduced straw bedding slightly, as outdoor temperatures allowed. He monitored humidity closely to prevent any lingering dampness in the house structure. Then, on a clear morning, when the thermometer outside read 42 degrees and rising, he opened the front door wide. The cows hesitated only briefly, as if aware that something was shifting. Again, he guided the first one down the porch steps and across the yard toward the barn. The air smelled different now, earth instead of ice. Across the road, Mrs. Harper watched openly, hands resting on her hips. Moving day? She called out. Spring. Hess here, Elias replied. One by one, the cows returned to their original stalls. The barn door remained open, sunlight pouring in and illuminating floating dust motes. The living room felt strangely hollow once emptied. Rubber mats remained in place for another day while he aired out the space thoroughly. He scrubbed the floors carefully, more out of ritual than necessity. The wood beneath had held up well. No warping, no staining beyond what thorough cleaning resolved. He removed the hay bales and carried them back to storage. He rolled the rugs back into place. Furniture returned to familiar positions. The sofa reclaimed its corner. The coffee table settled onto polished boards. By evening, the room looked almost as it had before. Winter? Almost, but not quite. It felt different. Warmer somehow, even without the cows inside. The walls retained a faint memory of sustained heat. The house had been strengthened not structurally, perhaps, but psychologically. That night, Elias lit the fireplace briefly, not because he needed to, but because he could. The flames flickered gently, reflecting off clean windows, now opened slightly to fresh air. He sat in his chair and considered the past months. Laughter. The questions. The coldest night, at 14 degrees. The steady 52 inside. The turning point had not been dramatic. It had been cumulative. 1 degree at a time, one night at a time, one quiet refusal to freeze. The town had changed too, in small ways. Danielus, breezeway modification remained. Another neighbor had insulated the shared wall between house and livestock shelter. The Harpers had reinforced their basement pipes and added supplemental heat transfer from their attached garage. No one announced these changes as inspired by Elias, but they had been. A week later, the town gathered for its annual spring meeting in the small community hall. Topics ranged from road repairs to planting schedules. When energy costs came up, predictably, a few heads turned subtly in Elias's direction. Daniel spoke first. "We might want to consider practical solutions before next winter," he said carefully. "Shared heat structures, insulation workshops." Mrs. Harper nodded. "Old methods, Aaron T. Always foolish," she added. The room murmured in agreement. No one mentioned cows in living rooms directly. They did need to. After the meeting, several neighbors approached Elias individually. "Would you be willing to show us how you manage ventilation? Think you could help me measure my barn wall for heat transfer? Mind if I borrow those BTU calculations?" He agreed quietly each time. Innovation had not required speeches. It had required example. Weeks passed. Grass returned in patches, bright and stubborn against the once frozen fields. The cows resumed grazing outside during warmer afternoons. The barn, once a secondary shelter, reclaimed its full purpose. Inside the farmhouse, life returned to familiar rhythms. Meals at the table. Evenings by the fireplace. Silence not filled by steady breathing but by wind moving gently through open windows. One afternoon, Elias found himself standing again beneath the thermometer in the living room. 65 degrees without assistance. He traced the faint outline on the floor where rubber mats had once rested. There was no visible damage, only memory. He thought about how close he had come to choosing pride over practicality, about how easily he might have burned through savings trying to preserve appearances. He had not set out to teach a lesson. He had set out to survive winter without freezing. But survival, when visible, becomes instruction. By late April, the story had traveled beyond the town in quieter ways. A cousin visiting from another county mentioned hearing about that farmer who heated his house with cows. The tone was no longer mocking. It carried curiosity, even admiration. Elias did not chase attention. He did not post explanations online. He did not give interviews. He returned to his routines. Yet something fundamental had shifted not only in the town's perception, but in his own. He understood now that ridicule is often a reflex to unfamiliar solutions. People protect their assumptions the way they protect their homes from intrusion. But when cold strips comfort away, assumptions become negotiable. One evening near the end of spring, Daniel stopped by once more. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. "You think you will do it again next winter?" Daniel asked. "If the numbers say I should," Elias replied. Daniel smiled. "Guess that's the difference," he said. "Most of us wait until something breaks." Elias considered that winter would return. It always did. But now it would return to a town less certain of its traditions and more willing to examine its options. Inside the farmhouse, the living room looked ordinary again, sofa in place, rugs laid flat, photographs restored to their shelves. No sign remained of the cows except a faint resilience in the air, a subtle sense that the walls themselves had endured something and come out stronger. The lesson no one expected was not about livestock. It was about humility. It was about listening to numbers over noise. It was about choosing sustainability over pride. And when the next cold front eventually swept across the plains months later, when thermometers again dipped toward freezing and wind began to press against siding, there would be no laughter in the town. Only calculation. Only quiet preparation. Only the understanding that sometimes the difference between foolish and brilliant is measured in degrees, and in the courage to endure being misunderstood long enough to be proven right.